Right, guys. I think now it's time for David Mullich from ArtCenter College of Design. And David will tell us how to be a game design hero. But first of all, let me tell a few words about Chris. He is game producer at Walt Disney Company, the 3DO Company, and Activision. Game design instructor of the Los Angeles Film School and ArtCenter College of Design. So I'm expecting very interesting speech from you.
David? Well, I hope that I can deliver an interesting speech. I certainly do have some ideas to share with everyone. So thank you all for attending. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, California, where it's now a little after 9 in the morning. So I hope you've had an exciting day too so far, but not so exciting that I don't have your attention. So I have a slide presentation to go with my talk, which again is how to be a game design hero, design tips from 40 years in game development. And came up with the title hero because many of you know I was the director of Heroes of Might and Magic 3, which I hear many of you are still playing even 20 years later. And I, in fact, appear as the hero Sir Mullich the Knight in that game. And as Vlad has explained to you before, I've designed many other games throughout my career, including DuckTales for the Walt Disney Company. I worked with Harlan Ellison on adapting his short story, I Have No Mouth and I Am a Scream, into a video game for Cyber Dreams. I also worked with Activision. I was a producer on Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, as well as about 60 other titles that I've worked on throughout my 40-year career. I spend a lot of my time now. I haven't given up game development completely. I still do consulting and I still produce video games. But I spend a lot of my time teaching. Currently, I'm teaching now at the ArtCenter College of Design, and I'm going to share some of what I've learned from my years in working on games. And what I teach at ArtCenter with everyone listening to me today. So I'm going to start off, being a game designer. This is a meme I show to my students in their very first game design class of what it means to be a game designer. Maybe you've seen this before. What my friends think I do, they think I play games all day long. What my family thinks I do, they think I'm just a kid who also is playing games with toys all day long. What society thinks I do, a lot of people still think that a game designer is a programmer or an artist, which, as you all should know, is not really the case. The game designer may and should know a little bit about programming and art, but that's not exactly what they do all day. And if you're part of a development team, probably what you think the game designer does, it's this image of pushing an elephant through a tiny barn door, which means that a game designer is trying to get the team to do far more work than can possibly be achieved. Now, what I like to think I do, I think that I create immersive worlds that other people can experience. And so ideally, being a game designer is like creating the whole deck in Star Trek, where people can go in and have all sorts of interesting experience. But what I really actually do, it's a lot of writing and calculating and planning and replanning and evaluating results all the time. But really what it all comes down to is that your job as a game designer is to create fun experiences for the player. And in a way, it's sort of like being the host of a party. It's your job as the host. You may decide on what decorations to have, what the party theme is, what food you're going to serve, what activities you're going to do. But overall, your responsibility is to make sure that everyone attending has a good time, has a fun experience. And so that's our responsibility as game designers. We're not there to satisfy ourselves. It's all about the player. How are we creating a fun experience for the player? So that kind of requires us to define what experience that it is we're trying to provide. And most novice game designers for the first time, they kind of they tend to be more like defining the experience in terms of what genre they want to do. I'm going to make a platformer. I'm going to make a first-person shooter. I'm going to make a real-time strategy game. And with that genre, well, there are certain actions involved in it. If I'm going to make a platformer, that means the player is going to be moving, jumping, and collecting stuff. If I'm going to make a first-person shooter, well, that means running and gunning, moving around and shooting. So that's pretty much defines what experience I'm going to create. If you think a little bit more about it, maybe when you pick a genre, it defines a little bit about how much action there is versus strategy, or how much the player is doing exploration versus engaging with conflict with other players or other characters. So, for example, a fighting game has a lot of conflict, a lot of action, whereas an adventure game may be more about strategy and exploration. And maybe if you're a little bit more ambitious, because you have more experience, or you're just a little bit bolder, you may think, I'm going to create something that combines different genres together. So I'm going to make a first-person shooter adventure game, which is always dangerous to do when you're especially if you're a brand new game designer combining genres together, because you may not have a full appreciation yet about what makes those genres fun to play. And in fact, if you combine genres together, you may wind up creating an experience that maybe isn't fun or doesn't take advantage of what each of the experience that each genre really truly provides. What instead I try to get my students to do, instead of thinking in terms of genre for defining experiences, I ask them to think a little bit more about the experience themselves, because that may allow them to be even more creative than simply duplicating what they expect a particular genre of game should contain based upon what other people do. Come up with your own game mechanics based upon the experience you want to provide. Because you could have, even if you do pick the same action can have completely different experiences. I mean, here's the action of driving a vehicle. These two pictures show essentially the same action, but a farmer who's driving a tractor in order to plow dirt in order to grow crops is having a very different experience than two kids who are driving this go-kart vehicle at an amusement park for having fun. Same action, completely different experiences. So what I ask game designers working for me, or when teaching, or when I'm designing games myself, is think a little bit more detailed about what experience you want to provide to the player, not just what action you want them to do. So there are a lot of different ways of defining experience. A lot of people have different models for it. And one model that I use frequently is the same one that we picked with a team where we designed the game design merit badge for the Boy Scouts of America about 10 years ago. And this is a model that was proposed by Jason Vandenberg, who at the time was creative director for Ubisoft, which is the company that wound up publishing the Heroes of Might and Magic series after I left New World Computing. And he presented it at the 2012 Game Developers Conference, and it was called The 5 Domains of Play. And basically what he did was he took the experience of play and using current thinking psychology at the time, he broke the experience of play down into five basic categories that play can encompass: novelty, challenge, stimulation, harmony, and threat. And those help define your experience. And in fact, you could have a playful experience that's low in a particular domain or high in that particular domain. Let's take a look at each of these domains separately. So novelty is a domain that distinguishes open, imaginative experiences from experiences that are more conventional or tend to repeat with each other. So you'll find games that are low in novelty if they're based on reality or they involve practical tasks. Or you can have games that are high in novelty. They can be more fantasy-based or involve more creative-type tasks. Now, neither is one or better than the other. It's really, what type of experience do you want to provide to the player? And some players prefer low novelty games to high novelty games. I mean, there's some players that like very realistic games in which they're doing the same procedures and rules and actions over and over and over again. Other players prefer games that are full of imagination, full of fantasy, not reality based at all, or maybe involve lots of artistic tasks with very few specified rules. It all depends on what it is that you want to provide as an experience for the player. And you can achieve this either through the art or through the game mechanics in your game. Another domain is challenge, which is really about how much effort or skill the player is expected to use to satisfy the game goals. And you can create a game that has easy goals, or where the player really can put off achieving those goals, or where they don't have to do a lot of preparation or organization for achieving goals if you're pursuing an experience that's low in challenge. Alternately, you could go and have very difficult goals or require the player to be very ordered or disciplined while they're playing. And you can achieve this based upon what mechanics or opponents or resources or objectives that you have for your player in the game. Stimulation of design, that's about how much emotion or social engagement there is in the play. So some people like low stimulation games like chess that are more slower paced, more logical rather than emotional, kind of more of a passive experience where you're reacting to their player. Other people that like more fast-paced games, or maybe games with a high emotional content where there's a lot of humor or excitement in that game. And again, you have a lot of tools or game elements for achieving this. You can do this through your player format objectives or mechanics. Harmony is a domain that is all about how players interact with each other. Low harmony games in which you have players that have lots of competition, or where the player objectives are about harming or destroying other things. Players with high harmony involve cooperation, or the players more focused on building rather than destroying. And again, some players gravitate more to one than another. Then finally, threat involves the game's capacity to trigger negative emotional reactions. Low threat games are ones that have more of a calm or peaceful atmosphere, or there's a very low risk of losing or feeling embarrassed while you're playing. High risk games are ones in which there is, of course, a greater risk, or there's a kind of a gloomy atmosphere. And again, you have a lot of different ways of achieving this. So let me look at a couple examples. On your game mechanics, high simulation game might have a game mechanic like a first-person shooter, where there's a lot of excitement because you're controlling the gun and things are happening very, very quickly, and you feel like you're really there in the environment. A low stimulation game mechanic might be more like a puzzle type game where you take your time and it's all about using logic to solve the puzzles. Notice both these games have the same setting. Both these games are set within a kind of a tropical jungle environment. So you could use the same environment, but have completely different experiences for them. All right, here's another type of game. Both of the two types of games, both of these involve flags, but you could have a high harmony game in which players are cooperating with each other to raise the flag, or a low harmony game where the players are competing against each other in order to get the flag. All right, here's a couple of games involving the same, both involving the resource of lives. You have to have at least one life in order to continue playing the game. But if you only have one life available in your game, the player feels more threatened. That is, losing the game is much more immediate. So if there's a feeling of tension that the player has when they're playing the game. However, let's say you want to create an experience in which there's low threat. You can alter that by giving the player more resources, more lives. The more lives they have, the lower threat that they feel. Obstacles. Well, if you have a game, platformer game, these are two platformer games, both involve running and jumping and collecting objects. Here, the only obstacle really is having to jump to the different platforms. So kind of low challenge, anyone can do this type of game. But if you throw in additional obstacles like monsters that are protecting each of the things you collect, suddenly becomes a very high challenge. So two games that are very similar, except for one respect, which is obstacles, but creating very different types of experiences. Feedback. All right, so we have two games here. They're both strategy games. Got Heroes of Might and Magic, in which it is a turn-based game. So, whereas here's World of Warcraft, which is real-time strategy game, faster pace. Pacing of the game is very different. So, Heroes of Might and Magic would be more of a low stimulation type of game. World of Warcraft, a high stimulation type of game. Again, very similar in terms of setting, in terms of theme, but different types of experiences. Number of players. All right, here we have a game, both first-person shooters, but in this game, you're only encountering one enemy at a time, versus this Call of Duty game, we're encountering lots of enemies at a time. This has a much lower stimulation than this one. Theme. We've got two chess games. Standard chess, which means a low novelty. Very little fantasy involved in this. Whereas another chess game based upon Star Wars, much higher fantasy type of theme. One has low novelty, one has high novelty. Some players much prefer the low novelty standard type of chess experience they're very, very familiar with. Other players like the novelty of engaging in chess and set in the Star Wars universe. Story, you may have a fantasy story, a story taking place in World War II, much more realistic, therefore lower novelty, or you may where especially history buffs know all about the weapons, how they're supposed to work within the game, the environments, how those are supposed to work, versus a more fantasy type of game in which you encounter monsters and they have weapons that may be magical in nature, and therefore you may not know going in how they work. Low novelty versus high novelty. And then even with the art and audio, we have two platformer games, same setting, but very different feelings of threat. This is much more of a cheerful type of game due to the color palette used, whereas this is much more of a gloomy game. So deciding up front what type of experience you want to create and what type of player you're trying to appeal for is something that you need to decide as a game designer up front. And once you've kind of decided for yourself what type of experience you want to create, part of your job is to go and figure out what type of game mechanics, player format, art and audio do I need to have in my game to support that kind of experience, and be consistent with it throughout the game. And those are the instructions that you are providing to the programmers and the artists, and that you use to flesh out your own game design. So what I encourage you to do in order to be creative in your game design is not just imitate what you see in other games that are the same genres you want to create, but rather start off thinking at first, how do I want the players to feel during the game, or maybe even what type of players I'm going after and how they want to feel during their games, and from there pick and choose the various game elements that are going to support that experience. You may wind up with creating something a bit more creative than you might normally just by copying what other people do. Remember this? This is from the meme I showed you before about what it means to be a game designer. This is what my team thinks I'm trying to do. It's trying to create a project so big and complicated that it's beyond their capability to do within the limited amount of resources they have or the time they have to do it. And when I work with new game designers and I'm teaching them, the biggest problem I have with first-time game designers is they tend to make games that are too difficult. They wind up making the challenges so hard, or things happen so quickly that the player doesn't have time to learn how to play their game and winds up losing almost immediately because they don't have the experience the game designer does, and they wind up being frustrated and thinking, I'm going to suck at this game, and therefore don't want to play it. After a short while, a game design student is going to learn you don't do that. You don't, unless you're going after the hardcore player, you don't make games super difficult at the start. But the second problem newer game designers encounters is they tend to make games way too complex than they need to be at the start. Too many features, too many rules, too many enemies, too many of this, too many of that. And the problem with that is, one, you can overwhelm the player. There's too much to learn. You can also overwhelm your team. The number one cause of failed projects is game whose scope is greater than your ability for the team to do, either because they don't have the skills or they don't have the time or the budget for it. And also for the game designer, you may lose the experience you're trying to create by putting too many elements in. You put in an element that completely ruins the experience. You may have problems tracking that down if you threw in everything. You made a design too complex all at once. This is what I suggest you do. And in fact, it's not my idea alone. This is something that is done at Electronic Arts, where they start off by defining what the creative center is for the game. And that's composed of two components. One is called the razor, which is a short statement about the game that determines which features belong and don't belong in a game. So, for example, let's say you're making a Medal of Honor type of game. So the razor for that I don't know what razor they came up with for that, but it might have been a realistic experience of the tension of real world battles, warfare in the 20th century. All right. So if you put that in one sentence, that can help you as you think about new features from the game. That can help you decide, does this feature belong in my game or not? So you come up with a feature of let's put in robot terminators in my game. That doesn't fit within the razor, so you toss out that idea. You put in magical unicorns that make you feel cheerful. Doesn't fit in the experience throughout that feature. Now those are extreme features, but as you get more detailed, the razor helps you define. You know what? As cool as this feature is, it really doesn't belong in my game because it doesn't match my experience. That's kind of a more logical way to go about doing it. There's another component, and that is the slogan, which is more of a catchy phrase that gets potential players and the marketing department for your game interested in it. So it's something a little bit more colorful. I forgot what Man of Duty's Medal of Honor slogan is, so it might be, I don't know, let's say the thrill of warfare. So that's much more of a colorful way of doing it. That also helps you decide, does this fit in my game? If it doesn't help enhance the thrill of warfare, or if it detracts from it, out it goes. Don't put that feature in my game. So try to come up with, at the very beginning, decide what is the creative center in your game, so you don't wind up putting in features that don't belong in your game and don't contribute to the experience that you're trying to create. Sorry, I have a phone going off here. Another approach to use is what's called the iterative design process. And this comes from Tracy Fullerton, who teaches a class in game design at USC, University of Southern California. And her basic philosophy is, in doing game design, you start off with an idea, and then you plan it out. You create a game design prototype, or you create a game design document based upon that idea. And you start off simple. And then you prototype it. You create a playable version of that game design document, and then you go and you play test it with players that are similar, who have the same interests and the same experience, and as the players who ultimately want to play the game. You observe them as they're playing it, and you collect data to figure out, are they having the experience you wanted them to have? Was it too hard or difficult? Too hard or easy for them? Or was it, did they not understand it? Were they looking for something that was more exciting, or were they looking for something that was more mental, more logical within the game? So you collect that data, you evaluate it. Did it match the experience you want to create? Then if no, then you go back, you revise your design, you create a new prototype, and you do it over and over again until you come up to a point where, yes, my team has created a game that matches the experience I wanted the player to have in terms of the quality level that they were expecting. And if you created a game like that matches the experience you want to create, then the game's shippable, it's releasable, you can send it out. Otherwise, you go back and you iterate and iterate and iterate until you create the experience that you want to create. So there's also an iterative process to development. There is a design, is you start off in designing by creating the minimal game that creates your experience. Basic action, basic goal, basic obstacle that makes the goal difficult, basic setting for your game, and then you play test it out with players. Does it match the experience you want? Yeah, you can go. If not, you tweak what you think you need to tweak. Do you need to tweak the obstacle? Do you need to tweak the goal? Do you need to tweak the action? And then when you're satisfied with that, once you have it, yes, I have a game I want. Then you go and you add another layer of complexity. Maybe it's adding additional action. Maybe it's adding a new variety of enemy. Maybe it's adding a sub-goal. Put that together as a prototype. Did it match the experience? No. Well, if it didn't, you can easily tell what ruined that experience, so you know what to tweak. If it's good, then you can think about adding something else. And then if that works, you have a little bit more complex game, you still have the experience you wanted, then you add something else. So it's all about adding a game in layers. Instead of trying to design the entire game at once, do it iteratively, one step at a time. So you don't wind up creating a game that's too complex, and it doesn't match the experience, and you don't know why. That, I would say, is a problem we had with Heroes of Might and Magic 4, which was a game that I developed. Wasn't nearly as good as Heroes of Might and Magic 3, and I think it's because we made too many changes all at once, and we really didn't have a good idea of why we deviated from the basic game, which is always a challenge when you want to reinvent a game when you're doing a sequel to it. You make too many changes all at once, you lose sight of why you didn't capture that experience. But if you do it maybe one step at a time, then maybe it will help you a lot more in figuring out how closely you're matching the experience that you want to have. Now, remember this before? What I think I do is create experiences, and what I really want to do is a lot of analysis and looking at numbers and figuring things out. That's a lot of that in game design. There's a lot of calculations and experimenting involved. And when we did Heroes of Might and Magic 3, we actually did a lot of our game design in Excel spreadsheets ahead of time. We would go and battle different creatures against each other using the combat formulas, and we would create Excel formulas that match our combat formulas, and then we would have a list of statistics and for each creature, the attributes and the values for the attributes. And then we put them in battles against each other multiple times. Real easy to do with Excel spreadsheet. You can do 1,000 battles in a split second, and then if we didn't achieve the balance we wanted, we could tweak the numbers. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how once we have a game designed, how we go about balancing it to achieve the experience we got. And here I'm going to define game balancing as the process of making sure your game meets the goal that you've set for your player experience. So here, I'm not going to use a example from Heroes of Might and Magic 3 because that was 20 years ago. I don't have all the data for it. I'm going to use an example here actually from a book written by Mike Sellers called I have a copy here someplace that was sitting on my desk and I don't remember it now. I think it's a systemic approach to game design. I think it's advanced game design, a systematic approach by Mike Sellers. Really good book. Suggest you go out and get it. And here he gives an example of, we have a number of different weapons from a fantasy role-playing game. And so we got daggers, short sword, cutlass, broadsword, rapier, longsword, great sword. And they each have different attributes associated with them. There is the chance of a successful attack rated on a scale of 0 to 8. The amount of damage they do on a scale of 0 to 8, and the speed at which you can use them on a speed of 0 to 8. And when we go and we map these all out on a chart, here we have all these weapons. And our immediate question we have is, are they balanced? And the answer to that really is no. And the reason why is that in the center, that a lot of the weapons are just too similar to each other. There's not really that much reason for ever using a short sword versus a rapier, or broadsword or cutlass. They're just too close, which means that if they're too similar to each other, it means there's not enough reason for the player to choose one over another, which means they're never going to experience. They're going to want to experience the different weapons. So what good is an experience that the player is not going to choose? So, in looking at that, we look at what are these weapons' different benefits. So each one, they have different benefits in terms of attack and damage and speed. So we want to balance these out a little bit better. And when we're balancing out numerically, what we do is we try to find a core resource that all these should be balanced around, something that we can measure all the attributes against in order to balance them a little bit more intelligently. And probably, in terms of a weapon, the resource that we're most interested in is how many hit points is that weapon going to take away from my enemy? That's really all that matters in terms of using it. The rest are really kind of supporting attributes to it. So in looking at these, I may think about, well, how should I prioritize these different attributes in relation to how likely they are to take away the opponent's hit points? And so what I did here was I decided, you know what? Speed is the most important thing. If I can't use it quickly enough to even connect with the other player, I'm not going to be able to do any damage to the player. Then I thought second highest priority is to actually have a successful attack once I have been able to use the weapon. And then my third highest priority was the actual amount of damage I can do. Because damage, unless I can actually use the weapon and actually cause damage, the amount of damage I use really doesn't matter. So I prioritized my weapons like this, and then I took each of the attributes and multiplied it by its priority and added them all up together and came up with a cost for that item. And the cost is really equal to the item's value. It's the way I took all the different properties and kind of used them to create one number. So this kind of told me about what different costs were. And then I eventually started manipulating the costs. I went because they were too close together. So I started tweaking around the different numbers a little bit, not much by each, but I went in and I broadened the range of some numbers a little bit. I think I made the dagger a little bit faster to use, even the greatsword faster to use, and I did a number of different other tweaks. And I eventually got costs that are more like this, which kind of made a little bit more sense. They were a little bit more spread out. And when I went and charted them out, I wound up with a series of weapons that, even though dagger was still the least effective weapon, good starting weapon for a player that doesn't have much money, and then the greatsword was the best weapon to get of all, something that you can really aspire to. I went. It was the most costly, but more importantly, the weapons in the middle. Each one of them had different strengths and weaknesses. Some was the fastest weapon to use. Some did the most amount of damage. So depending on what the player was really interested in, even though overall they tended to be, they tended to advance in an upward slope. They became more and more aspirational. Each one still they were different enough from each other that they become valid choices overall. So now I made it possible for the player to want to experience different weapons. And then later on, I tweaked the costs a little bit so that they were integers rather than real rather than half a gold piece. And I separated out. I lowered this a little bit, and I raised the greatsword price a little bit about this. But that I'm right now here for purposes of this talk. I'm more interested in the different attributes. And the point is, you go and you tweak the numbers so that players have without losing sight of the general goal of weapons being better, becoming better and better as you go throughout the game, still making each one a useful experience for the player. But another way to go about it is that some things are useful in certain situations more than others. For example, let's say you have an area of attack spell in a game. That's really useful when you have a lot of enemies surrounding you within the area of attack. Not as useful if you only have one enemy that's attacking you. Or let's say that you have a healing, a first aid kit in your game. Very useful. In fact, critical if you're about to die in your game. Not at all useful if you're fully healed already. Here I have a Magic the Gathering card. During each player's upkeep, Karma deals 1 damage to the player for each swamp he or she controls. Really useful if you have a lot of swampland. Totally useless if you have none. So you could have different elements in your game that, depending on the player's current situation, their current experience, those weapons are really useful, or they're not, or somewhere in between. So how do you go about balancing that? Well, let me give you an example. Here we have a very simple combat system example where the player has a base attack bonus in fighting. We'll call that BAB. And the default is 0. Your basic attack bonus for a player is 0. And then you have an attack class that the default is 10. So you got a player, when they're starting off in this game, they have a base attack bonus of 0 and an armor class of 10. And during each round, one player makes one attack against another opponent. And so therefore, if what you do is you roll a d20 for the random element in your game when attacking. You add that to the base attack bonus. And if it's greater than your enemy's armor class, then you hit and you do damage, which means overall you have a 55% chance of doing damage. So what is our core resource in here? Well, it's it's basically the amount of damage that we're doing. And so the next question we have is, are our secondary resources, base attack bonus and armor class, are they balanced? And the answer to that is yes. Because if you add 1 to your base attack bonus, gives you a plus 5% chance to hit. And if you add 1 to the your target's armor class, then it gives you it decreases your opponent's chance of being hit by 5%. So, in other words, they're balanced because if you add 1 to either side, it affects the chances to do damage the same. So we say those numbers are balanced with each other. However, that also depends on the situation. For example, if my situation is I'm one fighter and I'm against many different opponents, you know what? I'd rather have that +1 armor class than the +1 base attack bonus, because in a round of combat, I can use that base attack bonus increase only elsewhere against one opponent, whereas my armor, if I have a 1 improvement to my armor class, that helps me against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attacks here. So even though the two numbers are balanced in this particular situation, having a better armor class is much more important. It's opposite here, where you might have in your party many different players against one enemy. I'd much rather have increased to my base attack bonus because this giant is going to only attack one of the enemies, one of my fellow players at a time. So less of a chance of attacking me in particular. I'd much rather have a base attack bonus. Now, as a game designer, probably you're going to tend to want to prefer to create more situations like this than situations like this, maybe, because it's often you want to put players in situations where an entire party is at risk. If you're doing a multiplayer game, maybe if you're doing a single player type of game, you want to create situations more like this. So it really depends on the type of situation you're trying to create for your players, the type of experience. If you want to create more of this type of experience than this type of experience, this shows you which numbers that you want to, which values you want to tweak in your game to support that experience. If you want to create this experience, tweak your base attack bonus. If you're more after the one against many experience, tweak your armor class bonus. Here's another situation. What if the player has multiple different types of weapons and they can switch them instantaneously? So let's say I have armed with me, I have a knife, a grenade, and a sniper rifle. And the knife, really good at close combat, not very effective at medium or far range combat. We have a grenade, very good at medium range combat, not so good at close range combat because you might hurt yourself, not so good at far range combat because you can't hit far away. You can't throw it too far. Sniper rifle, good at far range combat, not so good at close range because you don't have time to use it, or medium range combat. So each one has different capabilities and different limitations. If you can switch your weapons simultaneously to adapt to the situation, you don't need to worry about their limitations. If you're close range, you can immediately get that knife. If you're at far range, you can immediately get that sniper rifle. That's all you need to think about is the capabilities. However, if there is a delay in switching weapons, then their limitations become much more of a factor in terms of what the player's experience is going to be. Therefore, choosing the right experience, choosing the right weapon quickly, and thinking about the situation is going to matter more to the player. That's going to increase the feeling of tension within your game about possibly choosing the wrong weapon. And then if the player can't switch any weapons at all, then it becomes a much more difficult situation. Here are things you got to think about. If you can't switch at all, let's say that, I'm going to use a little bit more of a complex example. Let's say you have a normal sword that you have at your disposal, and you have another sword that does 2 times damage against dragons, and you have a 10% chance of encountering a dragon. What is its cost or value relative to a normal sword? Well, that all depends upon your chance of not just its attributes, but also your chance of using that weapon. So it's really 90% of the time, it's the same value as a regular sword. 10% of the time, it's twice as good as a regular sword. So overall, it has 110% of the value of a regular sword. So that helps you determine how good that is, how valuable that weapon is to you. Now, let's say you have another sword, and normally it does 10%. This is a real easy one. You might as well always You should, if you can't switch, you always carry that dragon sword. But here's a different sword. Normally it does 1%. It does 1.5 times damage against a creature, but it has no damage against trolls, and 5% of your encounters are against trolls. Was its cost relative to a normal sword? Well, you got to figure out 5% of the time it's the same as having a broken sword. And so then you got to figure out, well, what is the cost of having a broken sword? And let's say you figure out by some process that a cost of a broken sword is equal to having minus 250 damage. That's a number I just made up because the exact process doesn't matter here. It's more weighing these against each other. Then its cost relative to a normal sword. 95% of the time, it is 150% of a normal sword. 5% of the time, it's negative 250 of a normal sword. So its value is 130. Still, in general, much more valuable than a normal sword. Now, let's say that you have a new object in your inventory. What is the value of that new object? It really depends on what is the percentage chance that you're actually going to want to use that new object. So let's say you have a Batman game. You have a number of different items in your utility belt. Let's say you have an item that's anti-shark repellent. Its value to you really is dependent upon how often are you going to have the experience of running into a shark. So that's something that you need to determine. Let's say you have 10 different weapons. Each one does major damage against a specific monster, and there are some have extra damage against a second monster. Some have a no effect against a third monster. How much should each cost compared to each other's? Well, let's say there are 10 monsters in your game, and you have a chance to encounter each of them equally. In that case, their value is all the same because if you don't know which monster that you are encountering, it really doesn't matter ahead of time because you don't know. Now, let's say you have a weapon that you have a knife. You have a knife that's very effective at short range. You have a sniper rifle that's very effective only at long range. And then you have a weapon that's kind of immediately effective at either short or long range. What is the value of the versatility of this particular weapon compared to these two? Well, it depends on how certain you are that you're going to have encounters at short or long range. So let's say that you're coming up into a new level and you have a 50% chance of that level being all the experiences are at close quarters. And then you have a 50% chance that your encounters are all going to be far range. You're working in an open space. Which weapon is the best pick? If the player doesn't know, it doesn't matter. You're offering players choices that don't matter because they don't know they don't know what experience they're going to have. So if you're giving players choices that matter, you have to let the player know ahead of time what kind of experience you're going to be giving them. At least some clue. It should be at least a discoverable clue. So I had about 10 minutes more about talking about rock, paper, scissors type of mechanics and how they affect experience. So Vlad, am I allowed to go over on this or do we need to save the rest of our time for Q&A?
Yeah, I think we have still enough of time, but if you finish it, we can start Q&A sessions right now.
All right. Well, I'll let you decide. Should I talk a little bit more, or should we immediately go into Q&A?
Sure. You're welcome.
Wait, no, which one should I do? Sounds like he's letting me talk a little bit more, so that's what I'm going to do. All right, let's say we have intransitive mechanics in our game, which is a fancy way of talking about rock, paper, scissors type of mechanics, where no one choice is inherently better than another. It's not like having that great sword that is inherently better than a dagger, but you might have a case where like in a real-time strategy game, where you might have tanks units that always beat a range unit, and the range unit always beats a flying unit, and a flying unit always beats a range unit. Now you may mix in some other things that make it a little bit more complex than that. Well, for our example, we'll talk about a very simple type of game, and we may see that type of thing in fighting games, where you have certain types of attacks where one always beats another, but no one is always useful in all situations. You may see that in a first-person shooter where different types of weapons are effective in different situations, like an example I just gave. So, in figuring out whether or not, well, let's use an example here, where indeed we have a tank, a ranged fighter, and a flyer. And in our game, our knights always beat our archers, and our archers always beats our dragons, and our dragons flying up above always beats our knights. But let's make it a little bit more complicated. Let's say that when our knights attack our fighters, they're going to win because they have got that heavy armor. But let's say some of the arrows they fire, they're going to cause our knights lose 20% health. Similarly, our fighters our archers will kill our dragons flying in the sky, but our dragons still have their fire, so they'll do 40% damage to the. Even though they died, they'll still do 40% chance of 40% damage to our flyer, and our poor knights are always completely defeated by our. They can't do any damage to our dragons because the dragons are flying above them. And they're out of reach of the fighters of our knight's sword. And let's further say that each knight costs 50 gold. That's their value. Each flyer costs 75 gold, and our dragon costs 100 gold. All right, so how do we make sure that this is balanced to create the type of experience we want? Well, here's a tool we use, and I didn't invent this, or I didn't come up with this. Actually, I learned this from Ian Schreiber, who teaches at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and has written a wonderful series of articles about balancing games. You can find them online. Just Google Ian Schreiber game design. He's also in the process of writing a book about game design that I'm anxiously waiting for. But he used a technique called a payoff table. And here we compare each of our different units against each other. And these are the payoffs of what happens when one unit fights each other. And that's in the capital letters, and these are the chances of encountering this type of opponent. But let's say we do indeed have a fight versus a knight. Whether you decide as a game designer they both destroy each other or they have no effect on each other, the ultimate payoff is 0. They cancel each other out. Same is true as archer versus archer. Same is true against flyer versus flyer. But if you have a knight versus an archer, well, you're gonna have the archer knight defeating the archer. You're fighting the archer. You're going to kill the archer. So therefore, the payoff to you is 75. The cost of that archer, as though you won 75 points by taking away 75 gold pieces of units from your enemy. So to you, that's a 75-point gain. But you've lost 20% health of your fighter, so you've lost 20% worth of your knight. So 20% of the knight's cost of 50 gold pieces. So the net payoff to you is 65. Sorry, the broke poorly. Is 65. That's the net payoff to you when you have a knight versus an archer. If you have a flyer versus an archer, though, well, your flyer is going to get killed, so that's a loss to you of 100, and 40% of your enemy's archers are going to be killed, and they cost 75. So that's a gain to you by defeating some of your enemy units. 0.4 times 75. So you have a overall net loss of a payoff of minus 70. So you figure that out for each of the different combinations, as you see in this table. And we can wind up what our payoffs are when we have knights. Your general payoff for using a knight, it's going to be 65 times the probability of fighting archers minus 50 times the probability of fighting flyers. Your net payoff for archers winds up to being 70 times the chance of fighting flyers minus 65 times the probability of fighting knights. And then your net payoff of using flyers, it will ultimately equal to 50 times your probability of fighting knights minus 70 your probability of fighting against archers. So that's what you figure out overall. What is the payoff for using each of these different units in battle? All right, so the important mathematical theorems that we need to consider. One is if we're creating a symmetric game, then each player should have the same solution. That is, the odds of winning or losing should be the same for each player. And that if a payoff is worth taking it all, in other words, if a unit is worth taking it all in a rock, paper, scissors game, it should have an equal payoff to all the other units. Because if it doesn't have an equal payoff, you're not going to use it at all because you don't know what the opponent's going to be. And if we have a symmetric zero-sum game, therefore all payoffs should be equal to 0. They should have the same solution. They should have a equal payoff. And therefore, if it's zero-sum, meaning that for every when there's a loss, there's an equivalent loss, then you're going to have a payoff equal to 0. And in a lot of games, we do indeed, sorry about this, we do indeed have another important consideration. So if we assume the payoff for a knight is the same as the payoff for an archer is the same as a payoff for a flyer, they're all equal to 0. So we assume it's all equals to 0. And then we substitute the payoffs that we calculated before. We should be able to use algebraic substitution and realize that 65 times the percent of chance of using an archer is equal to 50% chance of using a flyer. 50 times the percent chance of use of a flyer, and so on. our percent chance of using a flyer times 70 is equal to the percent chance of using a knight, which is times 65. So therefore, a flyer is equal to 13/14 knight if we reduce that down. Similarly, if chance of using a fighter is 50 times the payoff for a fighter is 50 times percent chance of using a knight times the minus 70 times the percent chance of encountering a archer. So therefore, we should come up with a payoff for an archer is 17/14 the percent chance of using a knight. And then if we have to consider that the probability of using a knight plus the probability of using an archer plus the probability of using a fighter is equal to 1. That is, the sum of all possible choices, the sum of probability of all possible choices should always be equal to 1, because you can never have the total probability of all choices be greater than 1. So let's say that our chance, just as an example, if somebody uses a knight 50% of the time and somebody uses a knight archer 40% of the time, 50% plus 40% equals 90%. That would imply that the chance of they use a flyer or dragon is 10%, because 50 plus 40 equals 90, and nothing can ever be greater than 100% or 1 in terms of probability. So therefore, the remaining choice is 100%, 10%. So we know from probability that the sum total of percent chances of using all of our choices should equal to 1. And therefore, when we go back and we do additional mathematical substitutions, we come up with these. Percent chance of using a knight is 14 out of 37. The percent chance of using a fighter is 13 out of 37. Percent chance of using a archer is 10%, 37. So that means that overall, if you want to do well in a game like this, then the ratio you should have mathematically for an optimal strategy of knights to archers to flyers is 14 to 10 to 13. That's the best combination of units that you're going to have. Now, whether you figure this out mathematically or you eventually discover this intuitively from playing over and over and over again, players will tend to wind up having this kind of strategy in their armies, which brings us back to the question: is this the experience you wanted to have for your players? Did you want dragons, their flyers, to be used that frequently in your game? If not, if you wanted dragons to be a much rarer creature, then you got to go back and modify these numbers somehow. Whether you modify the percent chance that they do, what damage they do against knights. The percent chance they do against flyers, against archers when archers attack them, or the amount that they cost relative to others. You got to modify that if you want to make dragons more rare to each other. Otherwise, players are going to want either. Otherwise, your game's going to start to become imbalanced. If you make dragons more rare, but they're that valuable, or they're only this valuable within the game. So you got to tweak your numbers mathematically to create the type of experience you want. Now, I went through this really quickly because our time was short. I went through a lot of numbers. if you don't understand how I derive these numbers, the important thing to affect the matters is when you're balancing your game numbers, make sure you balance them in such a way that they ultimately will derive the experience they want to create for your players. So I went over long by about 15 minutes. Kind of my main points are for this is that decide ahead of time what type of experience you want the player to have. Don't just imitate other games. Come on, think for yourself what experience you want to have, and then add in those features that support your type of experience. This features in terms of mechanics or actions, obstacles, goals, settings, music, and so on within your game. But start simple. Start with a very basic game and add complexity one feature at a time, so that if you start to deviate from your experience, you know why. You know what did it. You know what the culprit was. Balance each of your game objects so that each one have at least a benefit at least some point during the game. Otherwise, the player isn't going to bother to experience them. And make sure that its cost in the game is proportional to how likely it is to be used in the game. And then balance both the cost and the benefit combined together to create the experience they want. Benefit, why it's valuable, and cost, how likely it is they are to obtain that object. And then finally, balance your game objects so that they provide the experience you want to have. And you can either do that by balancing by altering the experience or altering the object. All right. Sorry, I went over long. That's everything I wanted to cover. So now I'm ready for questions.
It's ultimately brilliant speech, and it was full a lot of really useful knowledge. And by the way, I need to tell you that some guys from our chat, now I'm watching, they write talk more. So it's real. I'm not joking. They asked to talk you more. So really, it was really nice. So also we have a lot of questions. So let me begin with Yaroslav's question. He asks, could you tell of what, in your opinion, led to the success of your vampire, the Masquerade Bloodlines?
Oh my goodness. Why was that so successful? Well, I've given a lot more thought to why it wasn't as successful as it should have been, which was that we didn't have enough time to we were tweaking more we were adding in more features than we had time to tweak, which is one way. Either we added in too much, or we weren't given enough time to tweak all the features we had. You can look at it two different ways, and it wound up that our players wound up balancing the game through mods. But in terms of what made it successful, I think we gave the players a lot of interesting choices to make, and that there were values to each of those choices. So we had a lot of different creature types, a lot of different character classes they can choose from. We gave them a lot of different options for how they use those creatures, those character classes. We provided a lot of different scenarios where each class's unique abilities were helpful, were useful to the player. And therefore, I think we made each character class interesting, and because of that, the game was very replayable. So, if I had to pick one thing to say what made it successful, as I think we satisfied Sid Meier's definition of good game design, and that is giving the player a lot of interesting choices to make.
All right. The next one from Volodymyr. Please share the biggest challenge in game design perspective that has not been forgotten over the years during the development of Hero series.
The biggest challenge that has not been forgotten during Hero series. The biggest challenge in any series is when you're making a sequel to a game, how much what features do you preserve from the previous versions so that it has what the players liked about it, but what differences do you put in so it's not the same game? And I think that's always the biggest challenge. How much should be the same and how much should be different? So it's difficult. Sometimes you hit the right combination, and sometimes you don't. I think we hit it with Heroes of Might and Magic 3, and we didn't hit it as well with Heroes of Might and Magic 4. I won't speak to the Ubisoft versions, the sequels they've done afterwards, because I haven't experienced them enough. So I say that's always the biggest challenge is how much to make it the same and how much to make it different. And I think there it would be a case of to manage that, again, developing it one feature at a time and making sure that you play test it with fans of previous versions of the game to make sure that you're not making it deviate too much. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that with Heroes of Might and Magic 4 because we at New World Computing, we were working on 3 games at once, and we only had to develop resources for developing 2 games. So we didn't have enough resources for developing Heroes of Might and Magic 4 at the time we were making it, so we couldn't be as careful in developing it as we might have.
All right. Mohammed asks, how to decide when is the time to stop balancing the game, because sometimes there will always be some things that feels off no matter what you do.
Yeah, that's how you can. Steven Spielberg said about movies. Movies are never finished. They're abandoned. You just stop editing them. And I think the same is true as games. They're never truly finished because you can keep balancing them forever. And you either stop working on them when you run out of money, you run out of time, or you know what? When your playtesters say, this is fun. I had a good time playing this game, and maybe it's your time to stop. Don't worry about making it perfect. Make it fun. If it's fun, release it. Otherwise, you'll work on it forever.
Okay, thank you. And the next one from Vlad. Is Advanced Game Design a systems approach a good book for junior game designers, or do you have any other book suggestions?
There are a lot of great books. I think, that's a good one for junior game designers. Another book I would recommend. Absolutely. Every game designer should have The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. I don't have it here. I was looking for my other book. Tracy Fullerton's book on game design, and I forgot the title of it, and I don't see it on my shelf, but that's another good one to have. Tracy Fullerton's book on game design. Look up her name, Tracy Fullerton, and you'll see it on Amazon. That also is a really good book to have.
Okay. Hope everybody had a lot of time to make a screenshot. All right, the next one from Danila. Do you think it's still relevant to look into the tabletop games for ideas in 2021?
You know what? I think you should be playing tabletop games. There are tabletop games. There are new ones coming out all the time, and there's still innovation going on in the tabletop design industry. I have my students play tabletop games because it's a lot easier to see the mechanics going on in those games. You can see the numbers. You can see the attributes. You can see how the numbers change as you're playing the game, which is sometimes hard to do, often hard to do while you're playing video games, because that information a lot of time is hidden from the players. You know the rules. You know the formulas in tabletop games. And I think you can learn a lot about game design and improve your game design abilities, especially in terms of balancing, by looking at tabletop games. So I have my own students start off by playing tabletop games and designing their own tabletop games, so they don't have to worry about the programming aspects of it. Certainly, there are a lot of things in tabletop games that don't match the experience of video games. Often, they don't have the real-time nature. They may not duplicate some of the emotional experience, and they certainly don't always imitate the aesthetics or the controls of video games, but there's still a lot you can learn from them. Yeah, play both types of games. Read lots of books, watch lots of movies. The more you experience in life, the better game designer you are.
All right, I think that is all. So, David, thank you very much one more time.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.